Well, good morning. First, I want to apologize because a lot of my videos, for some strange reason, YouTube had defaulted to Mexican Spanish for the language. I don't know why it did that. I didn't authorize that. I didn't ask for that, but it did it, and it caused a lot of trouble. And it went on for a little while before anybody even told me about it. And I don't think everybody was hearing it in Spanish. Just some people were. One way or another, I wanted to make sure that I got that out of the way. Uh, Here's a few interesting little shop experiences that I wanted to talk about here. Heat damage, oddball leaks, and some other stuff. This 97 F-150 was very peculiar. Whenever you would let it idle in the shop, it would run at 200 degrees. You could let it idle for a solid hour. Now this had that little V6 in it, and you know, the 4.2, and but as soon as you backed it out of the shop and tried to drive away, you didn't even get 15-20 yards before it was trying to overheat. I mean, it was just like instantaneous overheating as soon as you backed it out. You could pull it back in the shop, it would cool back down to 210, and it would just stay right there. Well, it turned out on that one there, the water pump impeller had rusted completely off. Now, I had shown pictures of this water pump before, but I don't know if I'd ever explained in detail, you know, what kind of a problem it caused. You can't count on an on an impeller coming off to act this same way every time. It's not usual that you see this or not. I had another video I showed you a while back of an impeller that got loose on the shaft on the Dodge Caravan water pump. Didn't come off, it just wasn't working efficiently, and that one was overheating. But one way or another, as I had said before, you can take the heater hoses loose from the heater core and loop a clear hose in there like you buy from the hardware store or whatever, so that you're just temporarily watching this coolant flow. When you crank that thing up, you ought to see coolant just zooming through that clear hose. And if it's just sort of not moving much, or there's an air bubble there, then you got water pump issues typically. Now that's if your coolant is full. You know, obviously if you're low on coolant, you may have an indication there that there's some air. This 2006 Commander, the customer thought the water was making it into a cylinder past the head gasket because it was overheating and it was misfiring. There was no evidence of coolant ingestion in number 8, but we had a sooty spark plug. Now the guy that I had working on it was pretty sharp. He heard a little bit of noise under the valve cover. He said, "I'm hearing something under that valve cover on that side." Some of these students had really good ears, you know. But I said, well, let's go ahead and get the valve cover off. Well, the problem was the coolant, the air conditioner pipe, low side line, was running in the way, so we had to take that off. So in order to do that, we had to recover the refrigerant. But before I hooked the machine up, I wanted to measure the content of the quality of the refrigerant. And it turned out this thing had a bunch of hydrocarbons in it. And so what we wound up having to do, there was a little bit of mixed up numbers here, but the long and the short of it is, what we had to do is we had to use a dedicated machine to pull this out of here. And because, you know, a lot of this aftermarket fly-by-night refrigerant will have some propane and butane and stuff like that in there. Well, we had a roller rocker that was out of place, turned out on number 8. And so he got that put back in place, got the engine running smooth, but then we found the reason for the overheating. Somebody had been working on this thing that really wasn't very good at what they were doing, or really careless or whatever. This clamp was loose, just like you see it here, hanging back out of the way. Now, it wasn't leaking there, but there was definitely going to be a problem eventually. Whenever that enough pressure went through there to break that thing loose, it was going to blow off. But the biggest problem was this cheap plastic hardware store T that they put in there that cracked and busted and was leaking coolant everywhere. But that's why it was overheating. So we got all of that nonsense straightened out, and we got the Jeep Commander back to where it could command again. On this 2007 Silverado, they had an oil leak concern, and we used Diana Blacklight, and we had an oozing leak at the oil filler cap. And also the PCV valve part of the valve cover, which is, the PCV valve is actually built into the valve cover. It's kind of an orifice with a baffle down in there, and you replace the valve cover if you run into a situation like this. But the problem was, one of his problems, was as soon as he pulled up there and opened the hood, when he parked it on this LS engine, on some of these, this was like a 2012 model or 2007 or something. I don't remember exactly the year model. I put 2007 up there. but it probably was newer than that. Anyway, the long and the short of it was, he'd pull it up in his house after having driven it, open the hood, pull the dipstick right away, and it would say, "Oh, I'm a quart low on oil," so he'd pour a quart of oil in there. But on these engines, not every engine, but on these engines, the oil needs to go in, you know, even when it's hot, it needs to drain back down into the crankcase before you're going to get an accurate. So you need to wait about an hour or a little bit longer before you check the oil so you can get an accurate reading. He had overfilled the doggone thing with oil, part of his deal. But also, when we used our black light and our dye, we found this oil leaking around here. And so anyway, and that's the PCV issue over there. There's replacement valve covers that you buy for that kind of thing. You'll find them on the market because you're basically, to replace the PCV valve on this one, you got to replace the valve cover. But there's a redesigned valve cover that's supposed to work better than the one that originally came on the thing. This saw the same thing as far as an oozing oil cap on a Camry. This one had an oil leak, and you're thinking, well, you know, when the oil leaks, it runs down from the top, and it makes you think other stuff is leaking. I've seen people have, like on one Camry, I saw an oil pump gasket leaking, and it fooled them into thinking it was the oil pan, and they charged $400 to replace the oil pan. Turned out it was the oil pump. That was a car my son was driving back years ago. Well, anyway, the oil filter cap gasket is something we don't often think about. If the oil filter cap gasket is totally compromised, or somebody just somehow or another left it off of there, the PCV system can actually pull air in there that's not metered and cause your fuel trims to go wacky. If you don't believe that, get a mass airflow sensor car that's got running with fuel trims hovering near zero like they're supposed to be. Take the oil filler cap off while it's running. You'll see the fuel trim start to go crazy because you got a bunch of unmetered air going there. And so just be aware of the fact that that oil filler cap is the last place a lot of times you'll even think of looking for a leak or another problem, you know, in other words, an air leak in or oil leak out. This Grand Marquis comeback is on this right here. One of my students replaced the hood release cable on my dad's Grand Marquis. And about the next day it rained, and my dad called and said, "I got a bunch of water in the floor of my car. I've never had that before." I said, "Ow!" So I got it back over there. And whenever he did everything right, except he didn't pop this grommet into the hole. That's an easy mistake to make, but that caused a comeback. And obviously the carpet's wet now, and there's all kinds of issues with that. At the Ford place, what we would do, and at the college I would do it too, if we had wet carpet, you know, that wasn't otherwise compromised, we'd take the seats and the carpet and everything out of the thing and just hang it on a fence out there in the sun and let the wind blow through it, let the sun shine on it, let it dry out, and then put it back in the car. Of course, you need to fix the water leak before you do that, or you're wasting your time. Also, if somebody's been piddling around up in there, and this one here had a water leak coming in because somebody pulled this on that harness and popped this grommet out of place. And you can see where water had been coming in there. And so my mother-in-law had a 87 Chrysler that she had bought that was brand new when she bought it. And from the very time that she got it, it had a water leak. And so she drove it for several years like that. She'd have to keep a towel in the floorboard, kept going back to the dealership. They'd throw their hands up, say, "We don't know what to do." And this, they pushed it out of warranty, and so she was having to put up with that nonsense. And so me and my wife were over there visiting one time, my in-laws, and I said, "Let me have a look at that thing." And I says, "I'm going to lay on the floorboard with a flashlight, and I'm going to have you to wet the thing," because I knew it was going to be over there on the driver's side. And so my mother-in-law got a hose, and I was with the door closed on the car. I'm under there with the flashlight looking, and she was wetting it with a hose, and you could see water coming in through a seam between two body panels. And so I had to pull the park brake assembly off to see what was going on up there. And I took some of this body putty, this dum-dum that you get, and packed it into that place and fixed that water leak. The dealership could have done this, but they just kept pushing her out of warranty until she, you know, asked me to do it. There was another time she took it to the dealership because some of the dash lights were out on that same Chrysler. They wanted $54 to replace the dash lights. She said, "Well, I'm not paying that just for the dash lights. I can drive with half the gauges dark." And so she asked me about it, and I happened to have some of those bulbs with me for some reason. I don't remember what it was. Those little, you know, push-in bulbs, like you use in instrument clusters and all. I says, Yeah, I can do that. And so you're supposed to pull the instrument cluster out and take the bulbs out from the back. But I noticed if I took the face panel off that cluster, the bulbs were just right there looking at me. And so I was able to plug them in. My father-in-law was a barber, and he was leaning on the other door of the car watching me do it. And I put all those bulbs in there and turned the lights on. They all lit up. You know, I could see which ones weren't lit up when I turned on the dash lights. And, or, you know, park lights, those dash lights would burn. I replaced the ones that were bad, put it all back together. And my father-in-law says, well, you got that done in 11 minutes. That would have been an easy $54 for somebody. Anyway, that was just one of those, all that just popped into my mind. This was my 4-liter Explorer thermostat housing was leaking. A lot of this seepage here was actually coming from around the hose. But I said, you know, I ain't putting up with that, because I've seen so many of these things crack and leak and all that, and they're plastic to start with. Parts Geek has got this one here. If you go to the parts house and you buy this plastic one, and when I bought this one, you'd pay about $60 for one. And now it came with a coolant temperature sensor, which goes in that port right there. This one here was $60, and it was metal. And I actually replaced this plastic one with a metal one, and I put the coolant temperature sensor in it that was in it before. And that coolant temperature sensor's got an O-ring, and it just retains with a little horseshoe clip wire thing, you know, which is pretty interesting there. But anyway, that was an improvement. You know, when you got when you can make it an improved part like that, kudos to Parts Geek for having that in stock. You might be able to get it somewhere else. This supercharged Park Avenue Ultra was a '99 model. We had to replace this bad idler that was for the supercharger. That one right there, and the bearing had melted out of it and all that. And so I said, he said, I can't get it out, it's real tight. I said, just keep working with it. So he stripped the threads out in this aluminum bracket here, because this bolt was left-hand thread. Nowhere in the book, anywhere does it say it's left-hand thread. There's no reason for it to be left-hand thread, because that pulley turns clockwise. Duh. Why would they put a left-hand thread bolt holding a pulley on if the pulley turns clockwise? It makes no sense whatsoever. But that's what we ran into on that Park Avenue Ultra. Some engineer decided left-hand thread was a good idea there. I don't know why, but we went ahead and we replaced the pulley, and I had him go ahead and tap it out right-hand thread. You know, well, he drilled it out. He put a helicoil in there for right-hand thread, obviously. I think you may have trouble finding a left-hand thread helicoil. Anyway, he helicoiled it back down to 10 millimeter, 1.5 thread pitch. We put a bolt in there with a big washer, and we were good to go. This right here was actually a Torx head bolt, but it worked just fine when we got through with it. I got a nice little flash picture of this Caravan expansion plug leak. It was leaking from that expansion plug, and so I says, all right, I'm going to get under here, and when they put pressure on it, this thing comes shooting out of there like a water pistol, which I thought that was a pretty interesting picture. Here's a similar one. When we put pressure on this one here, now this is a little bit of a lesson here. This was an unexpected 3.8 liter Windstar cracked water pump leak. We were doing an oil change. That's all that vehicle came in there for, doing an oil change. And we happened to notice that it was wet in here around the belt area. So when we put pressure on it, this oil pump had a crack right along here, and it was just squirting coolant out everywhere. Now this is actually on my Technical Writer Facebook page. This is the header photo, because I thought that was an extremely interesting thing. I had them do that, and I took a flash picture of that to get that, because I enjoy taking pictures like that. But the point is, think about this for a minute. They bring it in for an oil change. You miss this, or any other kind of a coolant leak. They take it, it runs hot, and you just change the oil, and they come back wanting to know why it ran hot when you just change the oil. We were able to take and show the customer this and say, your water pump is cracked and we need to replace it. They're just fine with that. But if you change the oil and the water pump is cracked and you miss it, no matter what you tell them, some people will have a tendency to blame it on you. That's just the way people think. You remember the story about my sister had that 77 Caprice that she was driving out long years ago. This was 30 years ago or more, 40 years ago. And she says she wanted my dad to put brake pads on it because they were scrubbing. So he popped a set of brake pads on it, you know, jacked it up, put it on stands, put brake pads on it at his little old shop out there. He set it down, backed it out, the radio wouldn't work. So she said, well, you did something to my radio. And he said, no, I didn't do anything to your radio. So she opens her owner's manual and sees there's a fuse there it's blown, so she replaces the fuse. As soon as she turns on the key, pop, it pops the fuse. And so she was saying, oh, he did something that made this happen. So I pull the radio out of the dash, and when it wasn't touching the metal part of the dash, it wouldn't blow the fuse. But when I touched the metal part of the dash with the radio, the fuse would pop. So I took the top off the radio, and there was a capacitor right there at the back of the radio on the top of it. You could take the top off that radio, and had a big, it was a pretty good sized radio, like that in the 70s cars. And it had a capacitor in there that looked like a condenser in a distributor. I mean, it was a big old thing. And I just cut that little wire going to that capacitor, and it didn't blow the fuse anymore. So I got an old, I got a condenser for a distributor, a random condenser, and I wired it in there and all. It must be a noise capacitor or something. But that capacitor had shorted. Why did it happen when he was changing the brake pads? Correlation and causation aren't the same. My son Luke is in the IT business, and he uses that term a lot. This Ranger disaster. This is another example of correlation and causation not being, one thing wasn't related to the other. Now, he removed and reinstalled the steering rack. It was a worksheet, and right after he parked it, somebody noticed smoke coming from under the hood. Somebody was driving by, and they rushed over and opened the hood. The engine was on fire. I mean, we're talking yellow flames. The alternator, according to my forensics, apparently got hot enough to burst some stuff into flame and started this fire. And this was not all that long before I retired, and that truck was never repaired. It was basically sold for junk. So anyway, but Ford Motor Company had donated that when it had 30 miles on it. It had come from Allen Park, Michigan, because there was a flood up there, and this truck had been underwater. But now, I used the thing for 18 years as a trainer truck, before this ever happened. Never had any problem at all with it, period. And that was the alternator got hot. I mean, that's so unusual and out of ordinary. But think about this. You change the steering rack on a customer's vehicle. You have to run the engine for a while and get the air out of it, drive it around. You park the vehicle on the service lot, and somebody notices smoke coming from under the hood. Who's going to get blamed for that fire? You didn't do it, but running the engine, it just so happened that everything was a perfect storm. Everything came together, engine caught fire. This is one of those things that sort of blows up in your face. I always like to call this a circumstantial landmine. I don't know whoever else might have thought of that, but sometimes you did everything right and the situation blows up in your face anyway, This is a Kia spark plug disaster where the student did do something wrong. He was replacing the plugs, and like so many other students that have not been told this, rather than using a 3/8 hose to gently start the plugs by hand, he just threw them in the holes and hoped for the best when he stuck his socket down in there. And of course he dinged the first thread. This one boxed up the threads and stopped about halfway in on one of the cylinders. All the rest of them he managed to get lucky on those, but he got unlucky on this one. And it only went in about halfway, and he knew it only went in halfway. He knew he was tearing the threads up when he went in, but he just hoped that nobody would notice. And even when it was a coil-on plug, it was a little, small 4-cylinder, and you could tell that the coil that was plugged under this plug had a space under it. Well, anyway, I probably should have gone right behind this guy and checked, but for some strange reason, it got out of the shop with the hood closed and drove away. Ran okay for about, that rest of that day and part of the next day, and then it came back in there with the plug looking like this. That washer is there. When you compress that washer, screw in a plug in, it basically carries the heat out of the spark plug. Now, you won't always see this every time you leave a plug loose or every time a plug comes loose, but in this particular case, this was the worst case scenario. The fact that it got so hot because the plug wasn't able to carry the heat out. What heat was carried out through these threads that were already messed up anyway, and it just cooked that plug. This happened, I don't think she even went 20 miles, and this happened. And so this was a nasty business, and also it's able to sometimes pull some air in here that doesn't belong in there, past the plug, because of the operation of the piston, and that causes additional, like using a acetylene torch, Anyway, that was one of those disastrous things. This right here was a 98 Chevy F350 with a cracked head. Now, several shops had told him he had, that Spider fuel injection, that's what this one had on it. And he went to several local shops, and they said, "Oh, you got a spider, probably your spider fuel injection when you got to put a fuel injection spider on it." And he just had the idea that they were all filling him full of nonsense. It was a bunch of hooey. So he brought it over and said, "Hey, can y'all look at this?" I said, "Yeah, we'll look at it." So we pulled the plugs out of it just to see why it was, had this misfire. And this plug right here was dreadfully rusty. I mean, he'd been driving this thing like this for a long time. Pulled his head off, and that crack right there was letting coolant get right into that cylinder, and you can see how it rusted that valve and all that. Well, the kid that was working on it, this has boggled my mind to this very day. He was working on this thing, got it all put back together, got it running good, did the engine, the nuts and bolts work under there right. This was a shiny black GMC or Chevrolet, and it belonged to a guy that had actually worked for General Motors, and he was retired. But anyway, he was a really nice guy. But this kid drives this truck down the road. I have never in my life understood how this ever even happened, because it's never supposed to happen. While he's driving it, the hood flies up, whoo, and it bent the hood. I'm thinking the safety latch should have caught it. I even checked, and the safety latch was working right and everything. I don't know if he had a shop rag laying there so that the hood didn't latch, and he moved it before I ever got there. And he's like, I don't know. And this kid wound up, believe it or not, going to airframe and power print school and getting a job at the local military base maintaining helicopters. And I was thinking, angels and ministers of grace defend us if this kid's working on any helicopter that I'm riding in, because he can't even close the hood on a Chevy pickup. Beat all I'd ever seen. Radiator cap issue. Good cap, bad cap. For all of my career, just about, a bad cap would have a dangly valve. You pull a radiator cap off and that valve dangling, that's a bad cap, because the air is going to be able to just come and go. That's going to make all kinds of problems, because it's going to because if air can just come and go through there, like if your surge tank gets low on coolant, then you're going to have a lot of oxidation going on, rust and everything in your cooling system and all this. But then I started to notice some brand new Stant radiator caps. I pull one off and need another cap. The one that comes in from Stant's dangling the same way. This is a good cap, this is a bad cap. Okay, Stant, I would call the part shop. I'd say, hey, I need another cap. I don't like this with this dangly valve on it. He'd send me another cap with exactly the same part number, and it would look like this one. It wouldn't be dangling. So I'd say, what's up with this? And so he calls Stant, and Stant says, oh yeah, we make them that way on purpose. That's the official Stant rationale. Their vented cap design. It says features a return valve that hangs open till thermal expansion or steam pressure forces it shut. According to their documentation, it allows the system to remain unpressurized during initial warm-up. Really? Why is that even a thing, or has it ever been? They say, well, we don't want to prevent rapid pressure buildup that stress or burst hoses before the coolant's fully circulate. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. With all due respect to Stant, this was on their website. Modern cooling systems are built to pressurize early. That's the whole point of raising the boiling point and preventing localized hot spots in the coolant. Because if it boils the coolant away from places, there's going to be places where it's going to get hot. That's how you destroy gaskets and stuff like that. If you delay pressure buildup, it increases the risk of boiling in the cylinder head or hot spots in the block during idle or low flow conditions. This is just not a good idea. Bursting hoses? Well, if a hose burst during initial warm-up, it needed a hose anyway. Not because the cap sealed too early. It's because the hose degraded or improperly rated. That's a maintenance issue. It's not a design flaw in pressure testing. All right, now this is my homemade tool. I can't talk enough about this. I've got an actual video on my channel showing me using this thing on an Oldsmobile. But you keep that surge tank, you fill the coolant up as far as you can, you keep the surge tank full. With this cap that's got that spring and all removed, you see the cap with the shell removed, the coolant can just come and go as it wants to. And so what happens is, if you keep that surge tank full while this thing's warming up, it's going to push the air out, and then it's going to draw coolant in as needed. So, I mean, it's basically going to keep itself full of coolant as long as you keep coolant in the surge tank. You got to pay attention to that. Okay, and so whenever it has, it's basically doesn't have any pressure, because it can't build pressure this way, but it can warm it up. So It's basically got warmed it up, and if the coolant circulates back and forth and all that. When you take this cap off with the engine running, or with right after you switch the engine off, you're not going to have any pressure. It's not going to puke all over the floor like it does on a lot of times. You ever been working on the cooling system, without any, you get one of them special funnels from the parts to the tool truck and all that hogwash. I don't like those things. But I came up with this at the Ford place. I would put my hand over the radiator cap. It's kind of dangerous to do that because you may burn your hand a little bit. But I would notice what it was doing. It would push that coolant out through that hose into the surge tank, and then it would draw, coolant back in. In other words, it'd push air out, then it would draw coolant back in. And so here I'd wind up, I said, I think I can build me a cap, paint it red so you don't forget and leave it on there, and all that. And have a new cap close by there, and you just pull that out, put your new cap on after that. After the coolant in the surge tank is hot, and you can tell that it's all completely warmed up and all the air is gone. That's one of the handiest things that I ever, managed to come up with. And unless I taught somebody to do this, I don't know of anybody else that even does it like this. But all the cooling system bleeding that I did over the years, this is one of the slickest tricks that I think I ever came up with. That is the end of our presentation today. We've been here 26 minutes, and this was a funny little picture I saw. I got rid of the caption where it says, "That glorious time when the sign tells you to do a burnout." So this guy's doing a burnout because there's a sign there. Anyway, I'll talk to you guys next week. I really appreciate you coming around, and let me know what you think about this, and I hope you don't hear this in Spanish because I'm trying to make sure I said it where you don't. See you next time.